Good morning, and welcome to part 21 of our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're going to continue in chapter 7 and do verses 11 to 18. But before we do that, I want you to keep three or four things in mind, because this is a complicated section. First of all, it says in Isaiah 55 that God's ways, the Lord's ways, are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, so that we cannot know everything that God is thinking or all His plans. Now, Solomon touched on this a little earlier back in chapter 3, when he said that God has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. So keep those two things in mind, that we cannot understand all of God's ways. And some of this is reflected in the apparent incongruity of the way that things are. For instance, in Christianity, you believe that you have to die in order to live. You have to give in order to receive. You have to serve in order to lead. Christ did this. He was a servant, but He also was a leader. So there's a paradox to the way we sometimes think. And Solomon has already touched upon this in the first part of chapter 7, where he says, "It is better to be in a house of mourning than to be in a house of mirth. It is better for the soul to be serious than to be cheerful. It is better to take the hard way than the easy way. It is better to be serious and to do things correctly than to do things in a quick and easier way." And he says it's better to take the rebuke, criticism of someone who is serious than to take the false praise of someone who just wants to flatter you. Now, we know some of this by our own experience, but in a sense, it's incongruous to really consider this. And now he's saying in this next few verses that he wants to give you the wisdom to try and understand the perspective of wisdom and this. And before I do that, there's a story which is in David Jeremiah's book, Searching for Heaven and Earth, about a woodcutter who lives in the Chinese-Mongolian border, who has a beautiful white mare who runs away. And his neighbors come and visit him and say, "This is too bad. You've lost your horse. This is bad." And the woodcutter says, "No, how do you know this is bad? You're making a judgment. How do you know this is bad? This may be good." And apparently a few weeks later, the horse comes back, and with her is a beautiful white stallion. And the neighbors gather around again and say, "You now have two horses, beautiful animals. This is good." And the woodcutter says, "How do you know it's good? It may be bad." Sometime later, when the woodcutter's son is trying to break or ride the stallion, he's thrown and breaks both his legs. And the woodcutter's neighbors again come around and say, "Your son has been injured by the stallion. This is bad." And the woodcutter says, "How do you know it's bad? It may be good." Again, a few weeks later, Mongolia and China go to war. And the Chinese recruiters come and take all the young men of the village and recruit them into the army, except for the woodcutter's son, who can't go because he has two broken legs. So the point is, what appears to be bad may in effect be good, and what appears to us to be good may in effect be bad. And sometimes we need the wisdom, the perspective of wisdom, to try to understand what this is all about. And this is what these next few verses are about in chapter 7. It says, "Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Now, Proverbs 8:35 says, "Whoever finds me, or wisdom, finds life, and obtains favor from the Lord." Proverbs 3:18 says, "She, wisdom, is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are those who retain her." So what Solomon is saying is, wealth is great, but wisdom is greater. And wealth with wisdom is the best of all. For many people who obtain wealth, they obtain an inheritance, obtain a windfall, win the lottery, do so without the wisdom to know what to do with it. And it's actually more of a burden and a hindrance and a curse to them than a blessing. So Solomon is saying that wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who work on earth, under the sun, who work for material goods. Having the wisdom to deal with it is good, is necessary. And just as money can be a defense, can be a benefit, fortress against problems, it can be necessary to ward off difficulties, financial problems. Just as money is important, so is wisdom. So wisdom is a defense. Wisdom is a means of defending yourself, of protecting yourself, of providing for yourself just as much as money is. So wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life. And this is what Proverbs 8:35 says, "Whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord." So this is the first couple of verses in this section. And then it says, "Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful." In other words, life has ups and downs. God has not made our life a straight line of good things, of benefits, of prosperity. He has made life up and down. There are bends and crooks and sideways and potholes on the road of life. And we cannot straighten that out. We can do certain things and help it, but we do not have control over it. And why these things happen go with the idea that God's thoughts are higher than ours. Why do we at this present time have a pandemic which has thrown everyone's life into a turmoil? We don't know. It happens, and we have to deal with it. It's one of the major potholes of our existence right now. And we cannot make this straight. We can try, and we can do things which will help it, but we cannot straighten it all out. So that's what it says, "Consider the work of God. For who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful." So when we have good times, we should be joyful. We should be thankful. We should really recognize what God is doing and how we are benefiting from what he is doing at that time. But in the day of adversity, such as now with this pandemic, consider God has appointed one as he has appointed the other, so that man can find out nothing but will come after him. So we have to understand that we don't understand all of God's ways. And in adversity, we have to be thankful. In prosperity, we have to be thankful. We have to consider that God's thoughts and God's ways are higher than ours. Why these things happen, we sometimes will never find out. But God, overall, has a plan. And this plan is being worked out according to his satisfaction. So we have to have the wisdom to deal, first of all, with prosperity, when we have an inheritance, when we win something, when we come into some kind of a windfall. And we also have to have the wisdom to deal with the providence of God. That what God does, what God says, what God acts upon sometimes is beyond our comprehension. and beyond what we really can understand and know. And then there are puzzles in life which we have to have the wisdom to understand and to work through, because we will never understand everything this side of the veil. There are things which we just will not know, cannot know, but have to accept in faith. If we knew everything, if we knew all of God's ways and all of God's thoughts, then we would be God. So we have to accept what he is saying, and this is what Solomon is saying here. I have seen everything in my days of vanity. His days of living, and he says everything he did, and he did it all, was all vanity. In his days of living, in his days of vanity, we have seen it all. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness. And there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. And we often use the frame, why do bad things happen to good people? And we often know people who are right with God, who do everything they're supposed to do, who live a good life, who are generous, who love God, who perish, or who have a family tragedy, or have a financial tragedy. And we understand, we have to ask the question as to why does God allow this to happen? And we know people who are just the opposite, who don't even believe in God, who have no idea what to do as far as religion or righteousness is concerned, who do everything wrong, yet who prosper. And this is one of the miracles, one of the mysteries. We don't know what God has in plan for later on. And we have to believe that somewhere along the line, justice will take place. But right now, these are above our thoughts and our understanding. And this is why he's saying, I have seen everything in his life. I have seen the righteous man perish and the wicked man prosper. And he prolongs his life. We cannot understand and do not have all the answers for this, and never will. But he goes on to say, do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why would you destroy yourself? He's not saying you can't be righteous, you can't be faithful, you can't love God too much. What he's saying is that if you love God, if you're righteous, if you're religious, if you are wise, then don't flaunt it. Don't go out and show everybody else how wise you are, how righteous you are. There's a story also in Jeremiah's book about an adulterer who started to believe and attend church and became very righteous. He became so righteous that he started correcting the preacher, he started correcting everyone else, he started believing that he knew the answers to everything, to the point that the preacher finally said to him, I liked you better as an adulterer. At least then you were humble. So the question is here not to be overly righteous or overly wise, but not to flaunt it, to be humble about it, not to pretend that you know everything. No one has the answers to everything, and no one ever will. So to do it in a sense which is humble and which is compatible with everyone else's feelings and considerations. And he also says, do not be overly wise. Why would you destroy yourself? Because by acting this way, you actually destroy yourself. You've seen people who are who promote righteousness, who have bumper stickers saying religious sayings, who wear crosses around their neck, who get up and say a lot towards other people about the other person's behavior, but then they themselves go out and their speech is full of blasphemy, cursing. Their actions are just the opposite to what they speak. And this is how they destroy themselves, by their actions not living up to near what their words imply. Do not be overly wicked either. Do not be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also do not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. Don't be overly wicked. No one's perfect. So we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to do things which we will later regret. None of us is 100% the way we should be. But don't be overly that way. Yes, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things which we will later not be proud of or not be happy with. But don't make a habit of it. Don't be overly wicked. It is good that you grasp the meaning of how not to be overly righteous in your expressions or overly wicked in your activities in life. Because this is all a game under our control and maybe all part of God's plan. As he says in the end, he who fears God will escape them all. The main purpose is to have a righteous fear of what the Almighty states and apparently wants. So we live in an era of incongruity. We have to do things which we feel are not in our ideas the best. We have to experience things which are not in our eyes the greatest. We have to endure adversity. And sometimes we don't understand why. But the idea is that God's thoughts are higher than ours. God's means are higher than ours. And Solomon is saying you have to have the wisdom, the perspectiveness of wisdom, to understand how this works and to roll with the punches. There are potholes in life which we can't fill, but which God has put there for his purposes, not ours. So this is really this section in chapter 7, having the wisdom to have a good perspective on what God is doing and on the problems that may exist in our lives. We'll finish chapter 7 next week, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you next week.